Hello, kiddies. This is the Crypt Keeper, and you're listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Be careful what you ask for. You may get it.
Hey, campfire crew. Let's get it on.
The Man in the Crawlspace by MUK World. This happened to me about 5 years ago, and even now I get chills just thinking about it. I was renting a small house in a quiet neighborhood at the time. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was cozy, affordable, and had a lot of character. The only thing I didn't love was the crawlspace under the house. The access door to it was in the laundry room, a square wooden hatch flush with the floor. It was locked from the outside, and I've never had any reason to open it. I figured it was just pipes, cobwebs, and the usual creepy crawlspace stuff. One evening, I came home from work late. It had been a stressful day, and all I wanted was to shower and collapse into bed. As I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. My laundry room light was on. I was sure I had turned it off that morning, but I chalked it up to being absent-minded in my rush, and I turned it off again. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was coming from the laundry room. A soft, rhythmic thumping sound. My heart started to race. I debated whether to get up and check or just stay in bed and hope it stopped. That curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my phone for light and tiptoed to the laundry room. When I opened the door, everything was quiet. But then I saw it. The hatch to the crawlspace was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I distinctly remembered it being locked, and there was no way I could have accidentally opened it. Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself it might be an animal that had somehow gotten in. I shut the hatch tightly and placed a heavy box of detergent on top of it before going back to bed. The next day, I called the landlord to ask if there were any past issues I should know about. He seemed surprised and said no one had reported anything like that before. Still, he promised to send someone over to check it out. That night, I double-checked the hatch and even put a chair on top of it for good measure. I didn't hear any noises, and I started to feel a little silly for being so freaked out. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I froze. My bedroom door doesn't creak unless you push it slowly, and I knew I had closed it before bed. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, as I heard soft footsteps shuffle into the room. My phone was on the nightstand, just out of reach, and the footsteps stopped right next to my bed. I could feel someone's presence, their quiet breathing in the dark. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swung it towards the intruder. There was a man, crouched on the floor, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. He looked just as startled as I was. I screamed and bolted out of the room, running outside to the neighbor's house, banged down their door until they let me in, and they called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the man still in my house, hiding in the crawlspace. He had a small mattress, some food wrappers, and a collection of random items he must have taken from my house. The lock on the hatch had been tampered with, and from the looks of it, he had been living under my house for at least a few days, maybe longer. The scariest part? The police said they found a notebook with detailed notes about me. He had written down my daily routine, when I left for work, when I came home, even what I wore. There was also a list of plans, though they wouldn't tell me what was on that. I moved out the next week and stayed with friends until I found a new place. To this day, I have no idea how he got in or how long he had been watching me before I noticed something was wrong. To the man in the crawlspace, let's not meet. Ever. Skinwalker Encounters by Gretchen. To add some backstory, I live in an extremely rural area. My town's population is just over 200, and there isn't anything out here but mountains and desert. I'm also a firm believer in things like the paranormal, skinwalkers, Bigfoot, etc. We've lived in the same house in this town for 10 years. I can go into depth about how creepy the house is, but I want to first talk about my Skinwalker encounters. The first time I ever witnessed creepy things outside was when I was young, maybe 8 or 9. My siblings and I would play survival-type games at the gravel pits near our house. We never strayed too far past those pits because of odd feelings like things were watching us. We always had each other, so we never worried too deeply about it. One particular time we went there was a teepee down in the bottom of the pit. It was in the back section where we never went because it just seemed creepier. Keep in mind, someone had to cut down a couple of small trees, bring the logs to the pits, and then make this teepee. There weren't any trees to just chop up and set up like that. We all agreed it was strange and decided against being anywhere near the teepee. The next time we went to go play there was a dead crow or a raven, I can't remember which, in front of it. It was sliced perfectly down the middle, gutted without a trace of blood near the body, and laid wingspan out in front of the entrance of the teepee. This time we didn't stay. We all went home and didn't talk about the encounter. I can't remember how long it took us to return to the pits, maybe a week. But when we returned with our mom to show her the creepy teepee, it was gone. Not a single log left. The longer I'd lived there, the more I learned about those things that live out there. When it's quiet outside, I don't go outside. That's when creepy shit happens. I was once stargazing in our driveway, and I like to lay in the bed of our truck in the summer and just watch the stars. We lived near a few dairies and feedlots, and they move cows every night at a certain time. On that night, it was around 9 or 10, so the cows started getting loud, and I could hear the guys making whooping sounds to get the cows moving to their next pen. I heard a specific cow that sounded almost wounded, but almost human. It creeped me out, but I continued to lay and watch the stars. The longer I laid there, the louder the cow got. It got to the point where I couldn't hear anything but that terrible human-like wounded cow noise. My heart started racing and my hair began to stand up. I immediately went inside the house. My family loves to go camping. We go at least once a summer, usually in the same area. We have huge mountains that have all sorts of four-wheeler trails, a reservoir, animals, and all sorts of plants. One summer, we stayed in a new area, and I had brought my dog Toad with me this time. We had finished setting up, so it was time for us to gather up some sticks and brush to start a fire. I had a head start and took Toad up the road to start looking for some bigger sticks. When we made the corner and I could no longer hear or see my group, something compelled me to go into the woods. Toad and I stopped. I felt and heard something out there beyond eyesight drawing me towards it. All of the hair on my body stood up. I took a step closer, and Toad yanked the leash back towards the group. It pulled me back to reality, and I quickly realized how insane going into the thick woods was. Toad and I jogged back to the group that had started walking towards us. I didn't tell anyone about the encounter until we came home a couple of days later. To say the least, neither Toad nor I slept during that camping trip. What I felt was just as creepy as what I heard during the nights we were there. We have 7 dogs, 2 of which are huskies that love to run away. My mom constantly worried about them, and her huskies mean the world to her. Anytime they ran away, which happened to always be at night, we would have to jump in the truck and search for them. Again, to clarify, there is nothing in the area I live in. If you went down a cow road a couple of miles and screamed as loudly as humanly possible, nobody would hear you. If you disappeared, nobody would find you. One night, our male husky decided to chase a rabbit out of his fence collar. It was snowy and so foggy, you couldn't hear another person talk to you from 5 feet away. Because of the snow, we could see his tracks. My mom, younger sister, and I decided we would just follow his tracks and catch him out near the gravel pits where he usually ran off to. We got to the point where the gravel pits ended, and it was just miles of sagebrush after that. Again, I had Toad with me because he's my best friend, and I was not about to go out there alone. We decided that Toad and I would walk back to the house to get the truck, and my mom and sister would continue following the dog tracks. That way, nobody had to go back to the house alone or stay out in the nothing alone. I started making the trek back to the house, and again I couldn't see or hear anything because of how thick the fog was. I made it to about 150 feet from our house when I heard something whispering a language I didn't know. Except it was coming from the field, which logically, if someone was in the field, 1, that would be insanely creepy because it was like 1 a.m. And 2, I wouldn't have been able to hear them. Even without the fog, they would have had to yell. Just like when I was camping, I felt like I needed to go towards whoever was talking. I stopped dead in my tracks. Toad and I looked into the fog, trying to make out whatever that language was. As I felt more and more like I needed to help whoever was out there, Toad again started pulling me towards the house. We full sprinted back to the house, and I immediately got us into the truck and locked the doors. I sat for a while staring and trying to rationalize what had just happened. After a couple of minutes, I remembered that my mom and sister were still out there. So I turned on the truck and slowly started to drive down the road towards them, looking out for a sign of the damn dog so I could go back to the safety of the house. I cried the entire time we continued to look. I obviously stayed on the road and followed the single light that they had. I could barely make out the light, let alone hear them talking, further proving that whatever was calling to me was inhuman and wanted to lure me away from safety. We ended up going home without the dog because it was freezing out, and they had walked miles away from home without catching him. He did end up coming home later the next day. To be honest, if I hadn't have had Toad with me, I don't know if I would have gotten so lucky. I fully believe that missing 411 cases are tied with skinwalkers or some type of extraterrestrial being. I'm forever grateful that I skimmed past them and did not encounter them. Toad and I have a strong bond, and I now realize how important it was that we did. Without him, I would have gone into the woods or into the field, not realizing how scary it was. Even now, I feel uncomfortable and have tears in my eyes, just remembering these stories. Neighborhood Shooter by Chance. Back when this happened, we lived in a small one-story house, and I had just gotten done with my 17th birthday 3 months prior, in June of 2014. At this time, it was September. It was around 5 or 6 in the afternoon, right after sunset, and I was just mainly getting ready to shoot a short horror video of myself as Herbert West from Reanimator. Dress shirt, tie, glasses, the whole 9 yards. It was just a hobby I picked up because I wanted to create my own horror flicks after being inspired by movies that I liked. Anyway, I was shooting inside of my office after setting everything up to look more like a mad scientist's laboratory, until I heard my mom answer the door. It was our family neighbor, Eric. At first, I figured the guy was visiting, so I went to say hello and talked to him for a little bit before I went back into the office. I heard him telling my mom and dad, before they divorced, that he and Ryan just had a fight a few blocks away before coming over, and he sent a picture of himself with a 9mm pistol to Eric as a threat. My office wasn't far from the short hallway that was between the bathroom inside the house, my room that's next door to the office and my dad's room. So I kept on listening in while I was checking up on my 2 pet mice. One was white and the other was black. Their names were Socrates and Ben. Yes, I named them after the rats from the movie Willard. Both of them were fine, and I gave them food and water, and then went towards my computer when I heard the door open. I figured that Eric was going to go outside for a cigarette. But while he was outside, I heard a few footsteps that weren't too far away, since it was a walk-around block. Then right before I was about to leave my office, there was a loud bang, and I quickly ducked towards my closet. I heard my mom screaming at the top of her lungs, "Is he shot? Is he shot?" My mom, dad, and I had a really bad feeling that Eric had just gotten shot, and my dad called out to me and asked if I was okay. I was. I didn't get shot. But I listened, and I heard Ryan's footsteps running through the backyard while Eric was screaming at him. There was another gunshot, and this time it was close to my window. Again, I ducked down while I heard Eric chasing Ryan off. My dad began to call the police without any hesitation while I was keeping myself hidden in the office. We could hear Eric chasing Ryan down while Dad began calling the cops. Luckily, Ryan had missed, and the bullet had only shot past by and hit one of the trees. The neighborhood was around a wooded area. 30 minutes later, we heard cops pulling in, and they arrested Ryan, and they took him away in a cop car. Once my brain came down from the fear and adrenaline that was running through my system, I came back out to the living room to make sure my mom and dad were okay, while I was basically breaking into tears because in that moment, we could have died. My mom and dad comforted me while Eric was talking to the police. And then my dad went out to speak with them as well, after everything had calmed down and they had Ryan in cuffs. After that, we took Eric to his old neighborhood before we came back home, and I was glad that it was all over and done with. I knew that Eric and Ryan had bad history with each other because Ryan had stolen a lot from us, including an old TV that I used to watch movies on, and he possibly sold it to get himself drugs. Eric began drinking a lot after that, because of the shit that happened that night up until his death after we moved. Rest in peace to Eric. But to Ryan, let's never, ever fucking meet again. Intruder in My House by Sam Vanadium. First, sorry for my English. I'm French, and I'm not used to speaking in English. I hope I'll write it well. This happened in 2022, 2 months after that I had bought my first house. An old farm far from neighbors except one old lady, in the center of France. I was living alone, 28 years old, and unlucky because I'd broken my right hand the first day I'd gotten there. And then my horse broke my nose accidentally 1 month later. This happened during the summer, a thunderstorm night. I was sleeping in my room almost naked because of the heat, in the converted attic of the house. Around 11:30, I woke up because I heard a sound coming from the room next to mine. Something like someone was standing behind the wall between both rooms. Floor noises, different from wind and beams, which were creaking. Not believing at all that someone was actually in my house, I was lazy, but I did have to reassure myself if anyone was in my house. I have to explain that the second room has an access to the attic, accessible by a stair with an older door leading directly to outside. And on the attic's undeveloped part, there's kind of a mezzanine. When I came to the room, still naked and with my fractures, I didn't find anybody there. But the door between the room and the place I just talked about, with the outside, was open. I got to the top of the mezzanine when I saw a shadow take refuge under the mezzanine, trying to get out of my sight. At that moment, I realized I wasn't alone in my house, even if I wasn't sure about what I had seen. I quickly went back to my room, which unfortunately didn't have any way to be locked. I posted myself next to the only window, and then called my ex-boyfriend, who was a policeman living about 10 minutes from there. I stayed there, hoping I would be able to escape through the window if the intruder came into my room. I didn't know what to do, but I didn't want to just stick around and discover who was in the house. Sitting by the window was also the best position to see if someone did leave the house. I had a good view of everything. I want to add that I have practiced self-defense martial arts for a few years, and I was able to fight someone off, even if I'm a girl. But fortunately, no one came into my room at that time, and my ex finally got there. When he arrived, we went around the house together to find this intruder, but we didn't find anyone. For a second, I believed that I maybe had hallucinated everything. But then we heard my ex's little girl screaming. She was 6 years old, and my ex had brought her with her because he was living in a very dangerous place to leave her at home at that time. So he decided to bring her along, telling her that they were coming here to fix some plumbing trouble in order to not worry her. He had left her in his car, locked. When we heard her screaming, we rushed to see what was happening. She was alone in the car, crying. When we asked her why she was screaming, she told us that she saw a guy come out of the house, out of the old door overlooking the attic where I had been, then quickly approached the car and started shaking the door handles. Those were her exact words. Today, I still don't know who that guy was, what his intentions were, why he was standing in that place next to my room while I was sleeping, and why he tried to go after the daughter of my ex instead of just making a quick escape. All I have are questions and no answers. Animals Screaming for Help by Baphomet 7. Can anyone think of a wild animal in the U.S., the Pacific Northwest specifically, that could repeatedly scream for help in a distressed, deep, middle-aged man's voice? It's not a human? Backstory. I live in the Pacific Northwest, in a fairly populated but still mountain town. I specifically live on over 425 feet of riverfront. Last night around 9:30, myself and my partner started hearing an initially distant, indistinguishable voice screaming in a state of panic and distress. We live near a popular trailhead, and a few times over the years people have somehow wandered down our road late at night, sometimes inebriated, sometimes in small groups, sometimes transient. So when we started to hear an erratic voice, we got up. We started initially checking the parameters of our house and the road. There was absolutely no one out there. However, over the course of the next couple of minutes, the voice got louder and louder, and obviously closer, and it was screaming at the top of its lungs for help. I say help in quotation marks because it was a little difficult to make out. It sounded like a not fully enunciated help. However, whatever it was clearly in extra distress, screaming for its life, just yelling help. We could only make out help, like help with a soft P, if that makes sense. But the words sounded the exact same every time, and there was no variance or other sounds. Just the word help, back to back, in the most distressed voice I have ever heard. With how quickly the screams were approaching and a weird echo to them, we quickly realized whatever was screaming for help was actually in the river, actively being pulled down the river current. Our river is wide, fast-moving, and dangerous this time of year. There was no other way for a voice to be approaching so rapidly and from the location it was unless they were in the river. We see and hear a lot of kayakers and know how their voices travel down there. So, over the course of about 3 minutes, we heard what was a distant cry for help, work up to the point that it was so loud it sounded a few feet away, and then slowly get softer until we could no longer hear the screaming. Again, it sounded like a deep, middle-aged man's voice, and the screams were approximately 2 to 3 seconds apart, just back to back to back. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was an animal. We do see a lot of wildlife here. A herd of elk practically lives on our property, and we see bears and wildcats, too. We initially thought a young elk had fallen into the river, but no. We Googled just about every animal distress call, scream, or fighting sounds we could find, but nothing even came close to what we heard. I've always heard coyotes can scream like people, but definitely not an older man. I've heard bears can yell deep, however they have absolutely no definition to their calls, and elk are way more high-pitched. Same for all our local wildcats. Even the birds of prey and ravens that can mimic sounds didn't sound like this voice did. I initially called the non-emergency line because I wanted to convince myself it was an animal. However, they quickly patched me over to 911 and said I was the third call for the same thing. So apparently the voice was strange and concerning enough that my even more wilderness-raised and savvy neighbors were concerned, and the police department took it very seriously. Then, the more I thought and thought about it, I started to think. If I was in a freezing river fighting for my life screaming for help, I might not yell as clearly as possible due to the pure state of panic, distress, and my attempts to stay afloat. The more I thought about it, the more I became sure that it was a person. 911 sent out 2 police officers. They were extremely nice and they took the call seriously. But with just 2 of them, all they had were flashlights and a chainsaw, and they kind of just walked down to a few spots at the river and peeked around. When our city has genuine suspicion of a person in the river or a lost hiker, they send search and rescue and a helicopter. They didn't do that last night. I told my partner I wouldn't be surprised if the next morning when it was daylight, someone would find a body at the river spot. But now it's getting late in the morning and I've kept my eye on the police scanner and the local social media pages. I haven't seen anything. Now I'm back to really hoping what we heard was a wild animal. Tell me, does anyone know of a wild animal that could sound like that? What are the chances if that was a human, he could have pulled himself out somewhere down the line and gotten help? Or do we think it's just a matter of time until someone reports someone missing, or they find a body down by the river? Minor update. Within the last 15 minutes, a helicopter has begun tracing up and down the river and circling at an area a ways past my house. So I'm feeling a little discouraged that it likely was indeed a human. That being said, I haven't seen anything on social media, and usually my local police post updates about stuff like this, if it was indeed a human. They do that very quickly. Also, the locals usually buzz about things like this on social media, and I've seen absolutely nothing posted. So, I'm back to not really being sure about what's going on at the moment. Almost Robbed or Killed Because of My Stupidity by Grafcox. This happened shortly before weed was legalized in Germany. In Berlin, regulation was already quite loose. As long as you didn't explicitly bother anyone, you usually wouldn't get arrested for smoking in public. I've been smoking daily for years. I know it's not great, but that's beside the point. I can function pretty well while stoned. However, I almost never smoke in public, partly to avoid trouble, but mostly because I enjoy the comfort of my own home. One late night around 3 a.m., I was just chilling online with friends, ready to call it a night. I wanted to relax with a joint and one of my favorite shows, but unfortunately I didn't have any snacks left. Determined to end the night with a proper munchie session, I decided to hit up a nearby Spotty, a small convenience store similar to a 7-Eleven. At that hour, only the sketchiest ones were still open, often operating illegally. I grabbed my coat and keys, but stopped short before leaving. Why not add a little joy to this cold walk, I thought, and rolled a small joint. I lit it as I stepped outside, braving the freezing breeze. The area I live in is pretty rough, mostly foreign residents, many from Arabic countries. Poor integration has led to crime and violence being all too common, and even so I was in good spirits as I strolled towards the flickering neon sign of the Spotty. Just one more intersection to go. A group of men stood at the corner. They looked Middle Eastern, a bit older than me, and watched me as I walked by. It felt normal, nothing to worry about, I thought, already a little high. I crossed the street without giving them much thought. Then I heard a voice call out, "Routine ID check. Please show me your identification." My heart sank. Of course, this has to happen the one time I decide to smoke in public, I thought, and turned to face the police. Only they weren't police. It was the group from the intersection, now slowly approaching me. "Routine ID check. Please show me your ID. We're undercover cops," said one of them with a smug grin. I froze. The fact that they weren't cops became clear when, despite their demand, none of them reached for any identification. "You know smoking weed is illegal, don't you?" the man continued. His pupils were enormous, like saucers. It was obvious these guys had no authority whatsoever. But they began circling me. "Show us what's in your pockets," the leader demanded. Oh, so it's a robbery, I thought. As long as I don't resist, maybe I'll only lose my phone and the few bills I had brought for snacks, I thought. Then, a wave of dread hit me. My weekly tips, about €300 in cash, were also in my pocket. I had forgotten to deposit it earlier. Losing that money would crush my tight budget for the month. So what now? As I slowly reached into my pocket, the leader pressed me. "What's taking so long?" I pulled out an old pack of gum and some broken headphones, hoping to satisfy him. "Where's your wallet? I need your ID," he insisted. Still fumbling, too stubborn and stupid to hand over my tips, I inadvertently revealed something that shocked even me. The glint of a Glock tucked into his belt. Knives and metal rods are typical weapons here. But a gun? That was insane, even by local standards. German gun laws are incredibly strict, so my adrenaline spiked. Slowly, I pulled out the $5 euro bill I'd planned to use for snacks, trying to keep my expression neutral. "You don't have a wallet?" he growled, his face darkening. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, before this escalated further. Then, a desperate thought flashed through my mind. The Arabs in this area had a well-known fear of Russians, with frequent clashes between the two groups. Maybe, just maybe, I could use that to my advantage. In a heavy Russian accent, I stammered, "My friends have my wallet. They're coming soon. We're meeting here." To my surprise, their poor English comprehension worked in my favor. They exchanged glances, muttered in German, and decided to wait. I forced myself to look confused, maintaining the bluff. It worked. Their effort to translate or figure me out must have seemed to be too much trouble. The leader finally pointed at my $5 euro and said, "All right, then, you get us something to drink." Reluctantly, I followed them into the Spotty. They grabbed a six-pack of Coke and I paid, heart pounding. I was certain this wasn't over, that they'd either search me themselves or retaliate when my non-existent friends didn't show up. But then, just like that, they left. No violence, no further questions, nothing. I stood there in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Looking back, I can't believe I bluffed in such a dangerous situation. It could have been my last day on Earth, all over 300 euro. I've learned my lesson. These days, I avoid walking around late at night when the streets are empty. And to those guys from that night, let's not ever meet again. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or the podcast, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you could take a minute and give this video a thumbs up, I would appreciate it. And if you haven't considered it, maybe consider subscribing and tell some of your friends about it. Follow me on social media, links to that are in the description. And if you'd like to take your support of the channel even further, find a link to my Patreon page, or purchase some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. I have a storefront at tpublic.com, and of course there's a link in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.